2. Well, good afternoon. And welcome to this beautiful Impact Theater, because this is where the arts and science and engineering intersect to create mesmerizing performances and at the same time transformational research. It is the perfect setting for continuing the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Lally School with our event today. I'm honored that my friend and colleague Steve Case is with us today, and more on him soon. But let me begin with a special word of thanks to all of the panelists and other presenters at the earlier sessions. And I welcome our alumni and alumni and other special friends of the Rensselaer community. We have a number of them here. One always risks starting to introduce people, but I'll mention a few. We have Mr. Jeff Stewart of Memeo.com. I think the Agrawal brothers of eTransmedia are here, and Mr. Terrence Barton of G-Force Suspensions. And they've returned to join us in celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Lally School. We also are delighted that members of the greater business community and others are with us, and we're always delighted when we can have them here. And please welcome, and I note the presence of a very special Rensselaer student athlete. His name is Mr. Jake Sofer. Jake, are you here somewhere? I think he'll be around. He's an inventor of what's called the Rolio app, which is a projected multi-million-dollar sales tracking device, clearly data-driven, relevant to our discussion. And of course, I extend a very special welcome to all of our students, especially the students from the Lally School. And the conversation today is for you and about you. And thank all of you for attending. So let me begin. 190 years ago, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute was, or at that point the Rensselaer School, was established to apply science to the common purpose of life, common purposes of life. And since our beginning, which was on November the 5th, 1824, Rensselaer has been focused on scientific discovery and investigation and technological innovation, and on moving discoveries and innovations from the lab to the marketplace. Now, 50 years ago, in the midst of the space race, in fact, at the dawn of the information age, under the leadership of then President Richard Folsom, the new School of Management was established. Institute leaders foresaw the exploding technological revolution and wanted to ensure that our students were prepared to lead and succeed in the new era. And so today, as we mark the 50th anniversary of the now Lally School of Management, the world faces numerous complex global challenges, ones that relate to food, water, and energy security, challenges, as you know, in human health and the mitigation of disease, in a changing climate, in the need for resilient infrastructure, in physical and national security, and in the allocation of scarce natural resources, resources that people fight over. So looking to the world then and to the future, we have begun to transform ourselves into the new Polytechnic. Rensselaer is a world-class technological research university that uses radically new tools and technologies, many of them developed here, to unite a multiplicity of disciplines and perspectives in order to take on large, multifaceted challenges. The alumni and alumnae, the students, faculty, and staff, friends, and community leaders who have come together today in the spirit of entrepreneurship underscore the value of the new Polytechnic and the importance of this great crossroads we have here for focused, brilliant, and committed people. Now, Rensselaer people always have been discoverers and innovators. Importantly, they also always have been entrepreneurs, launching enterprises from Texas Instruments to National Instruments to NVIDIA, all the way to the data-driven companies of today. And as we sit here, an enormous amount of data is being generated by us for us and around us from multiple sources. The ways that we generate that data and mine, manage, preserve, and connect it by harnessing powerful new analytic and computational capacities will shape and change our world. But this, of course, requires the imagination and zeal of innovators and entrepreneurs, which brings me to our special guest. Steve Case is one of America's best known and most accomplished entrepreneurs and philanthropists. He is a pioneer in making the internet part of everyday life. He is the chairman and CEO of the venture capital firm Revolution. He also is chairman of the Case Foundation. Prior to starting Revolution, he was the co-founder, chairman, and CEO of America Online, and later the chairman of AOL Time Warner. He is actively engaged in the public policy arena at the highest levels in a range of efforts that are aimed at both celebrating and, importantly, accelerating entrepreneurship. He was a leading proponent of the Jumpstart Our Business Startups, or the Jobs Act, signed into law in 2012. Appointed by President Obama, he is the chairman of the Startup America Partnership, co-chair of the President's National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and a participant in the Presidential Ambassadors for Global Entrepreneurship Initiative. I have the privilege and pleasure of working with Steve as a fellow regent of the Smithsonian Institution. Now, Mr. Case, and I'll call you Steve, holds a BA in political science from nearby Williams College. Now, Steve is an ideal guest for this special celebration. He started his first business at the age of 6. The same year, I'm not supposed to say this, that the Lally School was formed, but more on that later. Now, we are proud to note that the discoveries and innovations of a number of Rensselaer alumni contributed to building the technological foundation that in fact enabled AOL to emerge. For example, Sheldon Roberts, Rensselaer class of 1958, was among the so-called Fairchild 8 who built some of the first semiconductors. Ted Hoff, Rensselaer class of 1954, is considered the father or one of the fathers of the microprocessor for work that he did at Intel. And Ray Tomlinson of the Rensselaer class of 1963 developed networked electronic mail and gave us the @ sign that we all use. He was working at the time for a contractor doing work for ARPANET, from which nearly 20 years later, AOL gave us the iconic message, you've got mail. Now, a direct and intriguing connection between Steve and Rensselaer is the company PlayNet that was launched in the Rensselaer incubator in the J building at the time, here on the Troy campus in 1983. The groundbreaking software developed by PlayNet was licensed by a company called Quantum, which in fact was bought by AOL. But most importantly, Rensselaer and Steve Case share a common purpose, and that is to apply emerging tools and technologies to drive innovation, to start new companies to change the world for the better. And so we're delighted to have him with us today to talk about how to cultivate entrepreneurs and how to grow an innovation ecosystem, especially one that uses data to unlock potential solutions to commercial challenges and to the grand global challenges. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Steve Case. Thank you. So Steve, you started your first business at the age of 6, a lemonade stand, right?
Of course, America.
America. Now, clearly you were precocious, although, many people have lemonade stands, but they don't all end up starting, AOL. But I'm curious, because this is a little bit about data-driven entrepreneurship. Tell us how you use data or information when you started, about where you might place that stand and how did you advertise?
Well,
how did you price your product?
First of all, it's great. I'll answer that question, but first I want to say it's great to be here on the 50th anniversary, although I do know it's slipped into the 51st anniversary. I know you guys are really good at math, but it likes to be Lally 51 would be a more accurate thing. But I understand this has been a lengthy celebration, and I'm actually delighted that it's, the end of that celebration is focusing on entrepreneurs and startups. I'm delighted to be here. And it's also, as you said, the history of this school, really over the 190 years, but certainly over the last half century, has played a pretty significant role in a lot of the technologies we take for granted, including the internet. And our success with AOL obviously was only possible because of that pioneering work. But if you really want to go back to my roots at the lemonade stand, I can't say I did use a lot of data when I was, getting started. My basic strategy, like most people with this brilliant idea of a lemonade stand, is to put it right in front of your house, whether there's traffic there or not. You realize after a while that sometimes there are better corners than others. My other great insight, my parents were actually quite sweet about this, but I learned after the fact the concept that the revenues should exceed the cost. There's this thing called gross margin. I don't remember exactly how much I charged, but I do know if the cost had been fully loaded on me, instead of being able to take the sugar and the lemons and everything, I think kind of for free, I'm sure I would have lost money. But it was a good experiment, and I learned after the fact that there is this thing called gross margin.
Got that. Now, just out of college, I think, you went to work for Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati for 2 years, and then apparently to PepsiCo, but you worked in the Pizza Hut division, I'm told, in Wichita, Kansas for a year. Now, you said that you honed your marketing skills and learned valuable lessons about keeping things simple. Now, maybe it's because you had to market your way out of Wichita, Kansas, but so talk about the importance of marketing and share, if you could share an example or two where that was critical.
I think it's a big deal. I will say when I graduated, from Williams, as you know, not too far from here.
Not too far.
I had a desire to do what I've done for the last few decades. I actually read a book when I was there. This is the late 70s, by Alvin Toffler, called The Third Wave. And he talked about the idea of an electronic cottage, an electronic frontier, and basically was predicting a world where people would have access to information and communicate in new ways and buy products and so forth. I was completely captivated by that idea. But when I graduated in 1980, there were no companies to go do that, and the startup ecosystem hadn't really developed the way it has more recently. So I said, that's my passion. I want to go do that. I don't quite have a path to do that. So why don't I go to some companies where I will learn some things, and hopefully some of those lessons will be helpful. First was P&G, and one of the lessons I learned there was they were pretty good at getting people to try new products and what they called sampling. And if they had a new shampoo, they would send samples of that out. That led to, I think indirectly, but I'm sure you were all at some point or another recipients of our rather ambitious effort to make sure everybody got online. And we distribute a lot of free discs and free trials. And my guess is some of that, maybe a lot of that came from that experience. And the experience with Pizza Hut, P&G was and is a great company, but it's gotten a little bit different. But at the time, 35 years ago, it was a pretty classic kind of top-down, kind of command and control company. The reason I went to Pizza Hut was it was sort of the opposite. It's kind of run by the franchisees, and the real innovation was happening on the periphery. I thought that would be an interesting, get a sense of how that they were thinking. And that was the case. A lot of we had people focused in Wichita in these essentially R&D labs trying to come up with the next great pizza. But most of the innovation, and what was my focus, we actually found in different parts of the country. So paying attention to what's happening on the periphery, I think, was probably the insight from that.
Well, that idea of simplicity seems to run through many of the endeavors you have and things you support. I mean, in a sense, you could say that AOL made it simple for the average American to get online. You have this company called Personal, which attempts to simplify the storage and the protection, and I'm going to come back to that, of individuals' digital information, and then everyday health, helping people to understand, making it easier to understand health challenges. But now we have this flood of data, and everybody talks about big data and the data revolution. Data is the natural resource. But with all of that, how do you find the simplicity amidst all of that kind of cacophony?
I think it's a big challenge, and it's also for entrepreneurs creates a big opportunity. I think, as we all know, there is a lot of data, but sometimes what's missing is the analysis and the insights and what do you do with that data? So being able to translate that, I think, is important. And some of that comes through technology and obviously algorithms, other things that help kind of understand and sift through and kind of help identify kind of the needle in the haystack. But I actually am a believer that you also need to have a broader perspective, and some of the things that you do get, including obviously places like RPI, that expose you to other things. Even this building had the fact that it's a multifaceted facility doing different things. I think that perspective is very important. So I'm a big believer in more of a focus on the STEM education topics, getting more people early on to understand why it's important and hopefully lead more people down that path. But I'm also a big believer in the value of a broader liberal arts kind of perspective on things. It allows you to understand things maybe in different ways and analyze things in different ways and communicate things in different ways. I think the brilliance of say Steve Jobs, one of our generation's probably most iconic entrepreneurs, was he had both sides of that. It was sort of a right brain, left brain, kind of understood the technology, but understood how to apply it, and there was a certain art to it and a simplicity to it that was really important. So the kind of things we focused on, whether it was AOL, and I mean, it seems crazy now to say this, but when we started in 1985, only 3% of people were online, and those 3% were only online 1 hour a week. So when we said we wanted to get America online, like, we're serious. I mean, it was kind of nowhere. And the reality is it took us a decade before we really got traction. It was a lesson in perseverance, and I always often quote the Thomas Edison line that vision without execution is hallucination. I had the vision, if you will, in the late 70s when I was still in college. It wasn't until the mid-90s that it really became a phenomenon, and it was just pounding away every day on the execution side. So I think understanding what's possible. I was not a technologist. I was not an engineer. I took one class at Williams, and kind of a computer 101 class. This was still in that punch card era, and I almost flunked out of school because I hated that class so much. The idea that you do this thing and you wait a few hours for somebody to run your program, I was like, what? And so that was not my interest. But my interest was figuring out how to take the power of that technology and make it available to everyone. And the rallying cry at AOL throughout its rise was, we wanted to get America online. We really believed it was important. In our peak, over half of all internet traffic in this country went through AOL. But we also knew we could only do that if we made it really simple and really affordable and really useful and really fun. And I used to say to our team, I've got to make this easy enough for my mom to use. Now, my mom was sort of offended by this statement. She said, why don't you say your dad? I know much more about this stuff than your dad. But it made the point that we were trying to make. We didn't just want this to be for technologists, people who understood and were comfortable with technology. We want to make it so simple that everybody could use it, and so compelling that everybody eventually would choose to use it.
And you did. So, everyone talks these days as well about the Internet of Things, right? Everything is connected. We have data, deluge of data from that, digital control systems. So that actually leads me to your whole focus, believe it or not, on the rise of the rest. Because when one thinks about the Internet of Things, one thinks about those who make things. So you just completed another Rise of the Rest tour. You traveled to 5 Midwest cities: Madison, Wisconsin, Minneapolis, Des Moines, Kansas City, St. Louis. But your first tour, which you took back in June, began in Detroit and stopped in Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Nashville. So can you talk to us about what you mean by the rise of the rest? And why'd you pick these particular Midwest cities to tour? What were you and your team looking for?
Well, we were looking to send a signal around the country, indeed around the world, that entrepreneurship is alive and well in America, and it's spread all over the country. I think the story around entrepreneurship in this country is generally told well in a positive way, but I think it's only part of the story gets told. And it usually is around technology entrepreneurship, right, which obviously I'm a fan of, but there's right, many other forms of entrepreneurship that also should be encouraged and celebrated and funded. And there's also too much focus on a few places like Silicon Valley, not enough on the great entrepreneurs building companies all over the country. So that really was the idea of it. And the backdrop, and you mentioned some of the things I've done on the policy front in Washington, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, I recognize that we are the most innovative entrepreneurial nation in the world. And I believe it is within our power and our grasp to continue to be, but only if we double down on entrepreneurship and make it easy for entrepreneurs anywhere in the country, focused in any sector, to get the capital they need to get started, to get the mentoring they need to get started, to get the attention, because now it's a battle for attention to get your company noticed, to be able to attract the talent, which talks in both terms of the education system within their community, being a boomerang to attract people into your community, dealing with immigration reform, things like that. We have to recognize that just as we've seen, say, 50 years ago, the globalization of manufacturing and some of the implications of that in the last 25 years, the globalization of capital, some of the implications of that. Now we're seeing the globalization of entrepreneurship. And it's sure, great for the world. There's some risk to this nation unless we understand how important this is. And what I remind people in Washington, because that's where I spend most of my time, is 250 years ago, America was a startup. It was just an idea.
That's right.
250 years later, we're the leader of the world. Why? Because we have the leading economy. Why? Because entrepreneurs innovated, first in the agricultural revolution, then the industrial revolution, more recently, obviously, the digital technology revolution. So it's not an accident that we're the leading economy. It was the work of entrepreneurs all across the country at various arcs of America's history. And so how do we make sure we understand that story and make sure that the next 250 years are as interesting in what is now a much more competitive world? And Rise of the Rest is not to say that I'm not proud of Silicon Valley. Of course I'm proud of Silicon Valley. And New York City is doing great things, and Boston's still strong, even Washington, D.C., where I mentioned I spend most of my time, is doing great as a startup community. But Detroit and Pittsburgh and Cincinnati and Nashville and Madison and Minneapolis and Des Moines and Kansas City and all St. Louis, all these cities are doing great things, building great companies as well. And we need to tell that story better than we've had. And it's also worth remembering that I talked about America's 250-year history. If you look back 100 years ago, arguably Pittsburgh was Silicon Valley.
It was.
Because Pittsburgh was the steel capital powering the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
50 years ago, arguably, Detroit was Silicon Valley. Why? The hottest technology of the day was the personal car, the automobile. And that was the most exciting place for that to happen. So these things kind of ebb and flow. And as a nation, we need to invest in entrepreneurs everywhere and have a more evenly dispersed innovation economy. If we have all our eggs in a few baskets, it's not the right kind of strategy for the country. And so celebrating these entrepreneurs and telling their stories and trying to get more investors to get on planes from San Francisco or New York or Boston to go to Detroit or Des Moines and recognize they will find great entrepreneurs there is part of that story. And of course, as you mentioned, there's also a lot of great entrepreneurs in this area. So hopefully,
well, actually, the other interesting thing about the number of the cities that you've mentioned is they also happen to be home to, or the areas where they sit, to great universities. Right. I mean, even though we know Rensselaer is the greatest, but Pittsburgh with Carnegie Mellon, right, and in Detroit, Michigan, the University of Michigan, and so. And
each of them, as you know, builds on its unique strengths. In Pittsburgh, it was not surprising that some of the most interesting startups in the Pittsburgh area are focused on robotics, because Carnegie Mellon is a real leader in that. And I think even the Carnegie Mellon history in being part of powering the Industrial Revolution, correct, and making stuff, gives them a perspective, almost a DNA that plays well in the Internet of Things and robotics and some of the next generation.
That's right. Well, you may not remember that, I was on PCAST, and as part of that, Eric Schmidt and I, which was interesting with his being
The
from Google.
PCAST, for those you don't know, we do little acronym jargon in DC, is the President's Council of Science Advisors. You got a big shock board that Shirley is on. But you call her here the president. In Washington, we call her the empress.
Oh,
she really is. And that's why I'm here, because she also mentioned she serves me on the Smithsonian. The truth is she's the vice chairman of the Smithsonian. I'm a mere regent. So basically, she says, I want you in Troy. And oh, yes, ma'am.
Oh, yeah. Now, now, clearly you can tell that he's a marketer. I could put, other words to it, but
And she has,
we'll
actually.
we'll leave it alone.
We'll go with marketer for now, this nice family audience.
But Steve didn't tell you that he's the chair of the Nominating and Governance Committee, so he manages to be a gatekeeper anyway, so this is good. So let's talk about partnership a little bit. We recently recognized as Entrepreneurs of the Year our 1991 graduates. You just talked to Jeff Stewart here, and then there's John Delbridge and David Utendale of Mimeo.com. Now, how important is finding the right partner? Or is it all about the singular person?
Well, I think there's been waves, and just looking at recently, even the internet, there have been 2 waves. I think there's a 3rd wave that's sort of breaking, and they actually have been different, and I think the 3rd wave is going to be different too. The first wave, which is the one I was really a participant, but at Cisco and many other companies did, it was sort of just building the internet, building awareness of the internet, getting everybody connected. So a lot of infrastructure and software and services and servers and communication lines and and content and community and all different things. And that was sort of 1985 to 2000-ish, that first wave. That required partnerships. Nobody could do it alone. The success of AOL was almost entirely related to our ability to knit together a tapestry of alliances. The reason it took a decade for the internet really to become a mainstream phenomenon is when we started, I mentioned the 3%. The reason it was only 3% is most people at the time did not have personal computers.
That's true.
The few people who did have personal computers, most of them did not have a modem. You had to go to the peripheral section of the store to get this thing called a modem. It was sort of non-essential, was the perception. If you were able to get connected, it was like $10 an hour, which is kind of a bummer. You're not going to stay on too long. If you actually you had the PC and actually got into the trouble of plugging in the modem and getting it to work and then connected, didn't mind paying that pretty high rate. Once you got on, the software to navigate was terrible, and there wasn't much to do. There was nobody to talk to and not much stuff to read. And so, not surprisingly, it took a while. Well, we had to, over a decade, just knock away at that. We got the PC manufacturers to build modems, and we got the communication networks from $10 to 10 cents an hour, which allowed unlimited pricing and things like that. We designed the software to make it more, more friendly. We figured out ways to build community. We always believed the killer app was people, kind of the getting people connected. So we launched things like instant messaging and people connection and things like that. But it took a decade of partnerships. That was the first wave. The second wave, the last 15 years, because the first wave built the internet, the second wave was really about building on top of the internet. Apps, products, services, Facebook, Snapchat, Google, Twitter are examples of things that were built on top of the internet and very powerful. That phenomenon was a little bit more of a Lone Ranger hits business. That Snapchat just happened to have the right app that kind of got the right initial viral following and took off, and suddenly it's a hugely successful. So it's very product oriented. It's win the battle for attention. It's viral oriented, but it tended to be a hits business, a little bit like the music business. There are a lot of great bands, but a few kind of break out and actually get noticed. That's really been the hallmark of this last wave, and it will continue. But the third wave, and it ties in with some of the work you're doing here, is how do you, because you built the internet and then you built on top of the internet, how do you integrate the internet seamlessly into every aspect of our lives? Internet of Things, hardware, sensors, things like that are part of it. How do you reimagine education in the future? How do you, kind of revolutionize healthcare and how do you keep people healthy in smarter ways and deal with chronic disease and serious illness in different ways? How do we manage energy in a smarter way? These actually are tough problems that are going to go back to requiring more partnerships. So I think this skill around around partnerships is going to be one of the defining skills for entrepreneurs of this next era. And the companies that figure out a way to connect themselves to others and almost build a network around their companies and have these tentacles where you really do build a tapestry of alliances, that's going to really be much more important in this next wave. And I think if people haven't seen it, there's a book that came out just a couple weeks ago, written by Walter Isaacson, I think it's called The Innovators. And he also wrote the biography of Steve Jobs, which was the best-selling biography, I think, in history. But what he says in The Innovators, and it talks about some of the I think you mentioned Ray Thomas and others, some of what happened over the last half century. It was the story of teamwork and collaboration. It was not somebody going off and doing things on their own. It was really waves of evolution, waves of innovation happening because of collaboration. And I think that recognition of that, which was so important that first phase, is going to become really important again in this next one.
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned the turnoff of having to use the punch cards. Well, when I did my PhD thesis, I'm dating myself, I used the punch cards. I hated it because if you dropped the box, you were all, it was all over. But then we came to the timeshare, right? I was at Bell Labs,
right.
And we had the timeshare, but you still submitted your job, and you weighted according to your priority. But now, in a certain sense, we're kind of back to that.
Right.
I would
Cloud.
say with the
Right.
cloud, right? But in a whole different kind of sense. But yet, as well, you talked about collaboration. And so that naturally brings to mind, social networks and how mobile computing plays into that. What excites you in that area? And what do you think is, how does that play into what you can do in health, what you can do?
I think to me, that's what excites me is I personally, I celebrate any entrepreneur anywhere trying to do anything. I think for the reason I mentioned, I think it's a core part of our making sure this country remains great nation. And every entrepreneur doing everything is anywhere. I'm a champion, but my personal bias is more for the entrepreneurs, and it's I know the theme of your plan here was entrepreneurs who really are trying to change the world.
That's right.
Our statement, if you look at the Revolution site or actually the Case Foundation site, both of them have the same mission statement, the same vision. We invest in people and ideas that can change the world. So I'd rather go for it. I'd rather take the risk, and it is risky, and swing for the fences and know that just as Babe Ruth, he happened to be the home run king, he happened to be the strikeout king. If you're going to swing for the fences, you're going to strike out sometime. And so we're looking for those ideas and those people that really are trying to change the world and deal with big issues. Learning is a big issue. Health is a big issue. Energy is a big issue. Transportation is a big issue. How do we attack those things, which are important parts of our lives and also important segments of our economy, and deal with those problems, but recognize that it is going to require more perseverance. The revolutions in healthcare are going to happen in an evolutionary way. It's not going to be an overnight thing. It is going to require partnerships. As I mentioned, there's an African proverb that I think is sort of animates this discussion, which if you want to go quickly, you can go alone, but if you want to go far, you must go together. It's around partnership and collaboration. So how do we get more people willing to take on these difficult challenges, but also big opportunities, but recognize that perseverance and partnerships are going to be more important, and the teams you build are going to be, critically important. Entrepreneurship is a team sport, and I think while celebrating Steve Jobs or others, I think is warranted at one level. We need to better tell the story, as Walter Isaacson did in his new book, around teamworks and collaboration. That's really how we change the world.
So here's the question, though. How then do you make a decision? And do you actually use, the new data techniques at all to even help you in decision making? So that's one part of the question. But the other is, how patient is capital today? Because to work on these big problems, and you say that a number of these things will be evolutionary. I think we're kind of used to the, swing for the fences, overnight sensation. But some of these issues are are not amenable to the trivial solutions.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And obviously there are a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of investors that do have a relatively short attention span and a short time horizon for if it's not successful, really quickly, then they move off it. I understand that. But as I say, my lesson from AOL was it took us a decade. And during that decade, there were times that it did not look like it was going to work. Mm-hmm. There were times when, like my parents were saying, I don't know.
When are you going to get a job?
I
right?
get you're passionate, but mice don't seem to be eating the cheese. Maybe it's time to do something else. And there was a lot of angst, and there was a lot of frustration, and there was a lot of near-death experiences. And then eventually, after a decade, we were like, oh, overnight sensation. Where did they come from? And so I think that gives me that bias that of course, if somebody can come up with something and next year it's hugely successful, of course anybody would like that. But that's pretty rare.
It is
and I think that the opportunities, if you're really going to tackle some of these big industries that are ripe for disruption, frankly, I think it's going to require more perseverance. Now, I think people are beginning to recognize that, and not all investors, but some. But it actually ties in with what we talked about earlier with the rise of the rest. Part of the reason I'm bullish on some of these regions is that, again, it's not bearish on Silicon Valley. It's bullish on, it's why it's the rise of the rest, not the fall of anything else. It's believing these will rise up. Is their history. They're actually rising up again because they were strong cities before. And the histories, the backstories these cities have, these communities have, and the industries in those cities have will help inform the big challenges, the big opportunities of this next wave. And I think there is a understanding in some of these places that we visited that it usually isn't an overnight success, and it usually does require perseverance, and usually does require partnerships. And that bias, I think, is, and by the way, the other piece is going to require more of, which entrepreneurs do not like to hear, but it happens to be true, at least in my opinion, is engaging with governments. The policy aspect is going to be more important in this next wave. Why? Because if you want to attack things that are fundamental aspects of our lives, like healthcare, the government's going to have a role.
They sure will.
They are regulators. They are the largest customer of healthcare. Education, the government funds more education than anybody else. Of course they're going to be at the table. So when we talk about partnerships, some of that is partnering with other companies. Some of that's partnering with other kind of nonprofit organizations. Some of that's partnering with universities or hospitals, or depending on what you're trying to do. But some of that's also going to be partnering with, or at least understanding and engaging with governments. That perspective, I think, is going to require a little bit different twist on entrepreneurship in this next wave. And of course, passion is going to continue to be important. Of course, product is continuing to be important. Of course, people are going to continue to be important, sort of the 3 Ps of this last wave. But in addition, partnerships are going to be really important, and policy is going to be really important, and perseverance is going to be really important. So the successful entrepreneurs who continue to do what's really worked in this last wave and then add to their toolbox, the skills that really will position them for this next wave, I think will define the great entrepreneurs and the great success stories in this next wave.
Well, it's interesting because we're trying to educate our students in a different way. That's the whole point of the new Polytechnic. So when we want to do something that we want to have impact across the institute, we do what we call the across the curriculum approach. So there are 3 approaches we've had. One is entrepreneurship across the curriculum, and now art across the curriculum, and data literacy across the curriculum. And so we're infusing that data literacy in many, many ways, but including in baseline courses in computer science and in math, which everybody here has to take, but also looking at it, whether it's in our Center for Biotechnology and Interdisciplinary Studies, and then we use the things with cognitive computing and all that. But we also have it in a series of master's degree programs here in the Lally School, one having to do with finance, and I'm going to ask you about financial markets, quantitative finance and risk analytics, business analytics. We have these programs. How important do you think that is to have this kind of data literate and data analytically literate population?
I think it's very important. I think the cross-discipline, interdisciplinary kind of approach, I think is critical. We talked about it earlier. I think the problems that also are opportunities in this next wave are complicated, and they're not going to lend themselves to to simple solutions. And understanding with some rigor, what's going on and why, that is going to be critically important. I think in the health area, if I was diagnosed tomorrow with a serious form of cancer, say, I would want really good data, understanding what's going on with those pathways and what are the different kind of options, and what, particularly for me as opposed to for a general population, what is likelier to be things that are the right kind of right way to intervene on that. I don't think one size fits all healthcare works. And now it's never really been that way, but it's been a lot of judgment without a lot of data. I think the data is important, but the judgment's important too. On the one of the areas, particularly in the K-12 side of things, that I'm most optimistic about is the reality is some people have tried, and it's obviously a difficult problem, but our schools today are not that different than what they were 50 years ago. Yet the world's changed a lot in the last 50 years. Certainly these kids have changed a lot, and the kids now in K through 12 are essentially these digital natives that just grew up with these tools. And so the idea of teachers continuing to do the same thing in the same way, for a class more generally, isn't going to make sense. Something that's more personalized and more adaptive, and really recognized based on data, that different kids learn differently. Some kind of want to hear it, some want to see it, some want to do exercises. How do you really customize the learning using technology and in part using data to reflect that? So I think this is the big opportunity for this next era. At the same time, I'm not a believer that big data in of itself is the answer. I'm not a big believer that technology in itself is the answer. It is part of the answer, but it requires a collaboration and a multifaceted approach. I do not believe entrepreneurs who are just focusing on the data are going to end up with the insights that essentially revolutionize education. I think they should talk to the teachers and talk to the professors, understand and talk to the students, and understand what's happening, and marry the perspective they bring, the technology they bring, the data they bring to the kind of the reality of the environment that exists now, and understand the culture as well. It's not just about technology, it's about people.
Well, that's interesting, because I was just about to ask you, how important are the two, what I call the two E's, empathy and ethics?
Very important, obviously. No, I think there's a great understanding of that, and these new opportunities are going to, this third wave I've talked about, are going to require both of those skills. Now, I'll give you some examples. The empathy ties directly into what I just said about having some understanding of the problem you're trying to solve, and not just in a kind of a linear, almost academic, kind of way, but in a practical, on the ground, kind of way. Having an understanding of the challenges teachers have, for example, having the understanding of the problems and challenges doctors and nurses have. They're complicated and they're serious, and so talking at them or lecturing to them and saying how stupid they are and here's why this new technology is going to make it so much better is just, if you don't have that empathy, you don't have that understanding, you're not going to have success. And ethics is going to be critically important. This next wave of data-driven innovation has, as you know, some really thorny ethical issues, including in the health space, but many others as well. So how do you balance that? There's going to be enormous tension. I mentioned the need to engage with government. It's not going to always be fun, because there's going to be a kind of this push-pull dynamic. What is the right regulatory regime for different things as they happen? It's probably not what we did in the past, because today is different, and tomorrow certainly is going to be different. How do you kind of right-size that or recognize that it's appropriate? At the same time, people right now are obviously really scared about Ebola. It's sort of kind of captured the the consciousness. They're also really scared about security issues and privacy issues, and they're reasonably concerned about them. So how do you leverage these new technologies in a way that really maximizes their ability to have significant impact, but do it in a smart, empathetic, ethical kind of way?
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned earlier the importance of of entrepreneurs understanding the need to interact with governments. And one example, and it relates to the data privacy and data security issue, is that in the EU, the Commission, the European Commission, is promulgating what is called the General Data Protection Regulation. And it's putting very stringent requirements in terms of how people's personal data is to be managed. And it has implications for cloud-based approaches to handling data and data privacy. And so people have to pay attention if they really intend to have success.
And even some, one of the most successful entrepreneurial companies in the last few years, and I'm sure people have heard of it, is Uber in the transportation area. And their strategy has generally been to kind of launch in a market and ask for forgiveness, not permission. And that actually has worked pretty well in most of these municipalities where there is some of the regulations I'm sure are there to protect consumers, but a lot of them are to protect the incumbents, and I think that's the real regulatory test for all these different things. Are you really trying to protect society, which is a noble thing, or is there some reason you're actually trying to protect the status quo, protect the incumbents who are the big funders of lobbyists and other kinds of things? So how do you make sure it's appropriate regulation, leaning into the future and encouraging more entrepreneurship and innovation, not protecting the past is going to be a key dynamic. So that worked pretty well for Uber, but for the fact that Germany just decided to shut them down.
That's right.
Germany's a pretty big country.
Pretty big.
The reason they're basic, and eventually, presumably, they'll have some discussion and engage. But that's a reminder that governments actually do have a legitimate role in regulating, and in some cases, being customers of some of these different sectors, some of these different industries. So, if you want to revolutionize that aspect of our lives and attack that opportunity from a kind of an industry standpoint, what goes with the territory is an aspect that you maybe didn't need to pay as much attention to in the second wave.
Well, I have a number of entrepreneurial friends, but what I appreciate about you, Steve, is the ability to and the willingness to articulate what most people know about interacting with governments but are unwilling to say. So why don't we open this up a little bit and see if there's some people. I could go on and on, but
That's true.
I'm trying to be empathetic. I'm trying to be empathetic, not selfish. So let me see. We should be able to hear you. I don't know if we have microphones. Okay. So maybe we could get some lights up in the room. Steve and I have the lights in our eyes. We like being stars, but it's better to see.
There we go.
There we go. So, please, yes.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm currently a junior here in the management program. I just want to thank you both for giving me your time for this. So, Steve, I've got two questions for you. First, kind of what's your favorite pizza? And then second question, you started a lot of companies, you've helped with the starting of many companies, you've built teams, you've given your support to teams. Kind of what do you look for in a strong team?
That's a great question. First to answer the question, my job at Pizza Hut my title actually said Manager New Pizza Development. They paid me to do this. And I basically was paid, because I said earlier I had this insight that the innovation wouldn't happen at the headquarters in Wichita, it happened elsewhere. I basically flew around the country eating pizza. This was my job, which at 24 or whatever was actually a pretty good job. So I try a lot of different pizza. I would say I guess I'm a traditionalist, but pepperoni is still would be my favorite. In terms of the question around teams, I think it kind of depends on what battle you're trying to fight, what company you're trying to build, because the teams you build kind of depend on, just as in sports, the teams are different if you're playing baseball or soccer or football or what have you. The key that unites all of them would be making sure, particularly the founding team, shares your passion about the idea, which seems obvious, but actually is usually not the case. Usually there are a couple of people who really believe, and others who are kind of like, well, that's sort of interesting, and maybe I'll try it for a little while, or some even actually skeptical, but figure, hang around the hoop, maybe something interesting will happen. And if there's not that alignment around passion, when the times get tough, and they usually do get tough, those people tend to kind of fall by the wayside. So really having a team that's united in believing it's an important problem to solve, an important battle to fight, I think is really important. Second is complementary skills. That we don't, you can't just have a company that has all engineers or all salespeople or all, whatever. It has to be an interesting mix, and you've got to make sure you're complementing your own skills, your own passion, what you're particularly good at, with what other people are particularly good at. Most people are good at one or two things. They're not good at everything, and so finding what are the skill sets required to be successful in that particular venture, and making sure that you surround yourself with people that have that shared passion, but also have complementary skills. And a third is a understanding that entrepreneurship is a team sport, and people need to play well together. And there are great athletes who are actually not great team members, and there are great executives of companies who are not great team members. And you need to be good at what you do, but also good at playing on a team. So those are the general, I think rules of thumb. Exactly how you approach it, and obviously depends on what you're trying to attack. If you're trying to attack healthcare, having people that have a medical perspective obviously is important. So there's some kind of specific skills that are necessary, but it starts with making sure people are united in their passion, have complementary skills, and really do understand that it's a team sport and have to work together.
Great. Gentleman here in the blue shirt.
Instead of jumping to get all of America online at the same time, did you try to think of stepping stones to get there?
We did. The reality is when we started in 1985, we didn't have much money. Our first round, I think we raised, over the 7 years before we went public. We went public in 1992 as the first internet company to go public. And up until that time, over those 7 years, we raised $10 million, which is not nothing, but in the battle that we were fighting, it wasn't a lot. By comparison, GE had a division that was in the business, and IBM and Sears, and for a while CBS, agreed to start something called Prodigy, and agreed to spend, and did spend, $1 billion. And we're also trying to compete with Microsoft and AT&T and others, Knight Ridder, that's pretty significant companies. So we were actually kind of a little guy. And we started a little team, a couple dozen people, and not much capital. So our strategy, goes back to what we said, was about partnerships. For the first 5 years, we did a partnership with Commodore around the Commodore 64, which, by the way, is where the PlayNet software came in, that came from RTP here. We then did a deal with Apple to create something called AppleLink, then with IBM to create something called Promenade, then with Tandy to create something called PC-Link. For the first 5 years, the play we were running, because we didn't have much money, is how do we get them to partner with us? We'll build something custom for them and then let them market it and bundle it with their computers or modems or what have you. It was only probably 5 or 6 years into it that we then launched America Online, which became AOL as our own brand. And that, by the way, which is another lesson around perseverance, only happened by accident, out of a crisis. Our strategy was these private label services. The reason we had to launch as America Online was because Apple, who had been our partner and had licensed the Apple brand name to us and had never done that before and quickly regretted doing it, said they didn't want to do it anymore. And so they actually tore up the contract and said, we'll give you some money. Sorry, we made a mistake, but you need to rebrand it, create your own brand, which we created America Online. We wanted to work with Apple. We had to create America Online, AOL, because of that. So we basically built these milestones, and it was walk before you run. And there were many years where we weren't sure we'd be alive when the sun came out, let alone kind of be the leader. But every year we kind of raised the bar and said, what's the next set of challenges, including what are the next set of partnerships that we need to form, or people we need to bring in. And eventually, after a decade, as I mentioned, it was sort of the mid-90s, it's sort of like, the internet thing, kind of cool. AOL's kind of everywhere. I guess that's the easiest, cheapest way to get onto the internet. I guess I'll get on AOL, and suddenly our growth kind of skyrocketed. But it was a long slog for really a decade before finally we saw the light at the end of the tunnel actually become close.
That's interesting. There was a hand up over here, Gina.
Hi, I'm Gina O'Connor. I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the Lally School, and thanks so much for coming. It's great to hear your remarks. So I have One interesting comment for you about the rise of the rest, and then a question. Yesterday, we got an email from an alum of our MBA program. He was 2003, Leap 2. His name's Mike Farmer, and I think you just funded him in Kansas City a couple of days ago. And he said, give a shout out to Steve Case, so that's what I'd like to do.
Oh, my.
It was so cool. So, and I think it was a fairly significant investment, so it's just so neat that you're here.
And I just actually saw him this morning because I just came from an event that Forbes is doing in Philadelphia called the Under 30 Summit, and they invited 1,500 of the most promising, kind of young people across all kinds of different sectors to it. And as part of that, we did a pitch competition, which I was just a judge for, but also we invited all the Rise of the Rest winners. Forbes invited them at our request to attend that event, so it was great to see him.
Well, that's good, because he's definitely not under 30.
I know. Well, we just said, well, I'll invite them all in. We'll give them a fake ID, a reverse fake ID. You're only 29. You look 49, but you're.
My question is, you're very engaged in the startup part of this country, and from a policy perspective, funding, all kinds of things. What are your perspectives on the health of mature companies in this country? So a number of us do research on that area and how mature companies try to renew themselves through sort of organic innovation. Do you have any?
There are obviously examples where that's been done successfully, but the history, and even look at the data around like the Fortune 500 or the S&P companies, they tend to turn over. I think it's every 25 years more than half of the companies turn over, and some decline, others because new companies kind of rise up. And so I think it can be done. It's tough to do. It does require a kind of a culture around renewal, a culture around taking risks, a culture around innovating, not just protecting what's there. I saw this as AOL got larger, and certainly when we merged with Time Warner, we kind of shifted from being an attacker to being a defender. Which was a subtle thing, but in retrospect, kind of had some profound implications. In the early days, we were just like trying to get everybody online, and we're trying to. Suddenly, we're the leader of the pack, and we're kind of like we're focused on protecting a public company, focused on quarterly result. I mean, all the things that larger companies, kind of get into, and we did lose some of that nimbleness and flexibility. So it can be done, but my bet is whatever we can do to be supportive of that, we should do. But if we're going to remain the most innovative nation, we're going to have to bet on the next generation of entrepreneurs who are now starting little companies, some of which will end up being big companies. And it's part of the learning for me, and hopefully learning from folks in Washington, is when you think about the business sector, there really are three sectors that actually are pretty different and operate differently. One are the large businesses, the Fortune 500, that care about trade policy and corporate tax rates and all, that there's a bunch of issues. The Business Roundtable in Washington represents those interests. The other are the Main Street businesses, small businesses, the Chamber of Commerce, typically restaurants and dry cleaners. Actually really important kind of foundation of our community, account for a lot of jobs, but neither of these actually accounts for a lot of job growth. The real job growth is coming from young, high growth companies. And so we're going to really be driving the next generation. That's the place to bet, which of course doesn't mean you give up on this or give up on that. And there are great examples of companies that, including some of them we visited when we were on this Rise the Rest tour in the different cities that are, Target in Minneapolis or Monsanto in St. Louis. I mean, there's still huge companies, hugely successful, that are anchoring these communities. You need to do whatever you can to continue to drive that reinvention and innovation. Best thing to do, by the way, there, if you're a large company, again, I have a bias. It's sort of like, like if they say, the only thing you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Everything to me seems to be solvable with startups and entrepreneurship. So I recognize I have a little bit of a bias there. But if you're a large company, build a network around your company and an open platform, so you actually are exposed to the ideas entrepreneurs have, either as a customer of some of those ideas or an acquirer or investor in those things. More smart people work outside your company than inside your company. More great ideas are outside your company than inside your company. So these command and control approach to the past just won't scale and won't work I'd say they don't work now. They'll work even less well in the future. And there are companies who have done that. Actually, in Minneapolis, again, I think it was, it might have been General Mills we talked about. They launched a whole effort around innovation and trying to reach out to entrepreneurs. So people are doing it. It requires a concerted effort of the leadership of those companies to recognize that they have to play offense, not defense, and lean into the future, not just protect the past.
That's good. Ravi, and then we'll come back across.
So First of all, thank you so much for visiting. My question was, what are your thoughts about net neutrality and the possible role of the concentration of power in broadband with the upcoming mergers?
I worry about it. I think one of the things that has made this, the internet great and certainly has driven a lot of innovation in this country is the ability that, it was kind of a level playing field. That was what when we initially got interested, I mentioned the Alvin Toffler book, I think part of my passion around this was around leveling the playing field. The time we got started, there were 3 TV networks that really were dominating what we were hearing. Newspapers were kind of the main voice in each community. There really wasn't an opportunity for a lot of voices. It was pretty limited. It was kind of an oligopoly, in most cases, a monopoly in some cases. We wanted everybody to have, the opportunity to have their voice heard, and we wanted every entrepreneur with an idea to have a shot at bringing that idea to life. So keeping the platform open is critical.
The gentleman in the light blue shirt and then the one in the white shirt. Yes, please.
I just want to share a little history. I was actually one of the founders of Prodigy back in '79, and an observation I have is that while we had the money, the vision maybe a little earlier, execution was everything. So I think it was the bureaucracy of large companies who thought they were entrepreneurs who really failed, and you guys were true entrepreneurs and succeeded. So kudos to you. I wish you were part of our team. Anyway, so much of that. But to talk quickly about really luck and timing. If you would, because you talked about other things, but really luck and timing, and having lived through it, luck and timing is a big factor. How do you see luck and timing playing into success so much?
Well, on your first point, first of all, I appreciate what you said, and I think Prodigy was scary to us because of the power of the companies and the amount of money they were prepared to spend. But we always were a little puzzled that it was mostly, there were some exceptions, but mostly staffed by people who came from those big companies who didn't really have, it goes back to the earlier question, necessarily have the passion. They thought, well, it's kind of seemed like an interesting assignment. I'll go do that for a while. But they weren't like living and breathing and gonna die for it, kind of a little strong. But they didn't have that kind of entrepreneurial passion. Luck and timing is a tricky thing, and I'd actually separate them. I did learn that you can't sometimes force things. Sometimes you just have to wait for things, even virtual reality. This morning I was with, he was honored last week at the Smithsonian Ingenuity Awards, this young guy, 22-year-old Palmer Luckey, who basically created this VR company called Oculus, which Mark Zuckerberg was intrigued enough to buy it for $2 billion. Pretty interesting. His view, and I share it, is the things they're doing now just weren't possible 10, 20, 30 years ago. So that really, sometimes the technologies do have to mature a little bit before it's the case. The only other side of that, I'd say, though, it goes back to what I was saying about AOL, and we needed to get more PCs out there, needed to get modems built into PCs, and we needed to get the communications costs down. We didn't wait for that to happen. We didn't say, oh, I guess the market's not ready. Go home early. It was like, okay, how do we fix it? So we actually took concrete, action to do what we could to accelerate, the timing. It wasn't just kind of, we weren't bystanders. We were kind of trying to make that happen. And luck, similarly. Obviously, any entrepreneur who's successful, there is an element of luck. At the same time, I'm reluctant to put too much focus on that because that could blind some entrepreneurs, the idea that it really is hard work and passion, and that there is, often you get lucky if you're working harder. It's not completely accidental. Not like, oh, I woke up in the morning and suddenly Palmer Luckey, I had this idea of VR, and Mark Zuckerberg called, gave me $2 billion. Awesome. It's not that way either. So I think luck and timing are really important. But there's some nuances to it on both sides that just need to be understood.
Yep. The gentleman in the white shirt here.
Chris Girardi, I'm a senior here using my GI Bill, coming back. And I wanted to ask you about, for entrepreneurs in a smaller company, what's the best way, in your experience, that you manage your resources, your very limited resources, and how to allocate them moving forward over that decade before you became that overnight success?
In the short run, in the early days, it's people in focus. It's very priorities. I mean, a lot of companies end up getting in trouble, almost indigestion. They try to do too many things, and they're not focused on the 1, 2, 3 that really matter. As they start scaling, kind of shift from being startups to what we think of as speed ups, it really is about hiring the right people and delegating them and trusting them. You can't be involved in everything. You've got to have a strategy that's more inclusive and basically says we're going to try to get the right people, we're going to try to set the right strategy, and we're not going to second guess. And I used to say, particularly when AOL was really growing, we went from dozens in '85 to about a little under 200 when we went public in 1992 to I think it was about 10,000 a decade later. So it was, it went from dozens to hundreds to thousands, pretty quickly, particularly in the last, the second decade. I used to say that if I'm a really great CEO, I'd wake up and have nothing to do. And the reason is, of course I never succeeded in this, but the reason is if I really had done a great job of setting the strategy and really done a great job of assembling the right team, and really done a great job in working with them to set the right priorities, and really done a great job in then empowering and trusting them, it should run itself. So it never did.
Yeah,
and what I would say is what would happen is I'd look at where I was spending my time on, and 100% of the time, I didn't have the right person, or we hadn't been clear on the strategy, or we hadn't been clear on the priorities, or I was second guessing them. So I'd say, well, how do I fix that? And once you fix that, then suddenly, you've freed up a bunch of time in your schedule.
It's interesting. Young lady here, and then I'll go up. Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Desiree, and I'm just a proud parent. Both my son and my daughter have spent time here at RPI. Brief story, I come from burger flipping, 40 years, 2 generations, and my son is an inventor, entrepreneur, and my daughter studies at Johns Hopkins for neurology.
I feel sorry for her.
Oh my God.
She's pretty competitive, yeah, exactly.
My point is I just appreciate your time and your realistic timetable of your success. I am a single mom, and failure came with my own entrepreneurship along with great victory. But most importantly, my son is here. He would never identify himself.
All right, stand up.
It's very inspirational, and I just thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, very
you.
sweet. Thanks.
Well, she's made a good point. How do you teach people, or can you, to move through failure?
It's an interesting point. I do think, first of all, I should say that one of the areas I think is really ripe for disruption, ripe for innovation, and we've talked about education, healthcare, and energy and transportation, is food. We've actually done a number of investments in the food business. One, backing a company that's doing healthier school lunches. Another, backing a fast casual concept that's really trying to get people to eat healthier options. And technology actually is a key part of that. My belief is in these fast casual restaurants, Chipotle being the most visible example, in our company, Sweetgreen, that 5 years from now, probably 75% of the people will actually order before they walk in on their mobile phone, walk in, be recognized, and automatically pay for it, and walk out 30 seconds later. So it's about food, but the technology will reinvent that experience and create convenience in a pretty powerful way. And the issue of failure, we actually launched, my wife runs the Case Foundation, we launched an initiative about 2 years ago called Be Fearless. And if you search on the Case Foundation site, you'll see a whole program on it. And it really was designed to encourage people, particularly in the nonprofit sector, but it applies more broadly, to take risk. To reasonable, measured risk, not just crazy risk, but all the great innovations happen when people are willing to take risk. A lot of our organizations, whether they be large companies or nonprofits relying on the grants or government agencies, they tend to be very risk averse, and you're not going to get to the right answers. So the whole idea around Be Fearless was inspire people to think out of the box and kind of take some risk and just kind of push things forward, because that's really where all the great innovation happens. And one of the good things about communities like Silicon Valley, I was talking about the rise of the rest, one of the areas the rest needs to get better at is recognizing that entrepreneurship is hard, and often people do fail. But that doesn't mean they're failures. That just means that particular idea at that particular time with that particular team with that particular product did not work. But eventually it can work. My first startup, we talked about P&G, we then talked about Pizza Hut, then we kind of segued into AOL. There actually was 2 years in the middle where I joined a company that failed. Basically doing what we now think of as the internet. But I learned some things there, met some people there. Ultimately, that led to being smarter, and ultimately led to the success of AOL. So understanding that, I think, is important. Silicon Valley does a better job of that. Failure is just part of the DNA of the place. But there are many communities, including where I grew up in Hawaii, that actually are pretty risk averse. And I don't know about that. And if somebody's an entrepreneur that fails, they're told you it wouldn't work. And that's not the culture that we need to create to instill a set of values around innovation, in each community, but also for the country overall. And if we don't have that kind of risk-taking mindset, we're going to lose our way. I mentioned 250 years of America as a startup. Remember, the people, a lot of them floated over on boats to find a better life. That's pretty entrepreneurial. That's pretty risk-taking. We need to make sure we remain in that same entrepreneurial zone and recognize that it's hard and lift people up when they're down, not knock them a second time.
You should be proud of your daughter, importantly, proud of yourself. So, let me see, up there in the back.
You're not proud of your son because he won't even stand up and be recognized. Come on, last chance.
My name is Eric Litt, and I'm a professor of biomedical engineering here at RPS. As an educator, we obviously would love to give our students the skills, the experience, the tools that they need to go out and be successful innovators, successful entrepreneurs in the future. And I'm wondering if maybe you could take a second and educate us, the educators, and if you had a short list of experiences or skills that you think would be important for us to give to our students while they're here, what would that be?
Well, it's a great question. And different universities have done different things. I've seen a bunch of different models. I don't know exactly how things are working here. But the fact that you're spending a day celebrating entrepreneurs and showcasing startups, I think, is a great sign of that. I think one aspect that's important is to recognize that ideas only go so far unless you figure out a way to hand the baton to a passionate entrepreneur who wants to take that idea and run with it. So how do you figure out ways to identify promising ideas and link them to entrepreneurs and then to teams and then to investors? And there are a lot of aspects to it. Tech transfer, some universities tends to be a little stifling. There's not, ideas don't get out. It's just a little too complicated. So having a light touch on tech transfer is part of it. But I think there's more that happens around the culture on the university. So having events like this, hosting things like startup weekends and just things that really expose to people to what's happening, inviting alumni who've been successful entrepreneurs back, I think is a critical part of it. There is a role for entrepreneurship education and different colleges, universities do it differently, but that's only a piece of the puzzle. What's happening kind of culturally and institutionally, I think it matters far more. The last thing is to then tell your story. It goes back to the rise of wrestling. How each of these cities has great stories, great startups, but don't necessarily get their stories out. So how do you make sure people understand what's here, and so people are able to, whether they are an entrepreneur, an investor, or a reporter, or a potential customer, or what have you, understand what's there. And so you have to kind of curate your ideas, curate your startups, and create some sense of almost package them so that they reach a wider audience. But it really starts with people saying it's important. It's important. How do we, take these ideas and bring them to life? That's how change happens. As I said, the Thomas Edison quote: "Vision without execution is hallucination." Having the ideas, having the vision, awesome. But unless you execute against that vision, you do not succeed. And you can't do that unless you build an entrepreneurial culture around that idea, a team around that idea, a network around that idea.
Up there, yes.
I'm Mark Amdex, and I'm from Belgium. And there are many people in this country, let's say country to Germany. You hear me okay there?
Yes.
There are many people in this country to Germany, who are on minimum wage and are not as well connected. And there are even more people who don't even have the minimum wage. Do you have any ideas how to get these people on the bus?
Yes, well, I have some ideas. There's some initiatives that are being worked on that I think would be helpful. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier around entrepreneurship. Even though I'm viewed as a tech guy, I'm not here to talk just about tech entrepreneurship. I think there are far broader forms of entrepreneurship. And I'm proud of the things that are happening in that sector, not just the jobs being created within those companies, but the spin-off jobs that are created in the communities around those companies, including restaurants and housing and a different kind of thing. But that's not the only answer. I think we do need to do, as a country, a better job of encouraging the creation of startups that actually are creating middle-class jobs. Technology has hollowed out some of those jobs because of automation, productivity. Part of the reason we back companies like Revolution Foods, they've hired 1,500 people in the last 8 years to focus on that. So a bias and some incentives to focus on not just creating wealth, but for a few, but jobs for a lot is critically important. The other thing we've seen in all these different rises of the rest cities, most vividly I'd say in Minneapolis, there's a place there called the Global Market that really is doing some interesting things. It's hard, but they're making some progress in creating a path into entrepreneurship for people who really are struggling. Picking some of the toughest neighborhoods in Minneapolis, people don't have the education, don't have the money to invest, and in giving them a pathway that's led to some interesting stores and restaurants being created, some of which are now expanding. One in particular, I remember meeting this guy a couple weeks ago, Enrique, who's got this Lola's tamale business, and he started with nothing, and he built one thing, and now he's got like 3 things, and he thinks he could be like the Chipotle of tamales. And I don't know if he can, but I wouldn't bet against Enrique. And that's an example of opening up entrepreneurship and creating on-ramps. Sure, the high-tech, high-skilled jobs are going to be a key part of that, and indeed, in many respects, every company has some tech overlay. I mentioned the fast casual dynamic, so that can continue to be important, but how do we do a better job of also creating the companies that can create the middle-class jobs? And there's a UVA report, I co-chair an initiative that's coming out with a report in a few months, that basically the theme of it is middle-class entrepreneurship. Can startups save the American dream? And I think that middle-class piece is important, and also creating this on-ramp for people that really are struggling, so they have a shot too. If we do that across the spectrum, I think we maximize our creating opportunity for a lot of people, creating jobs for these communities, driving growth, which helps fund government and all the services we take for granted, but also maximize our ability to remain the most innovative entrepreneurial nation. Right.
Let me see if there's anyone over here, up there. Okay, this is the last question, Jackson, and then Steve has said he would walk through and look at
some of these
and talk
startups.
to some of the folks with their startups.
So, my name is Jackson. I'm a graduating PhD student. Thank you very much for coming to RPI. In my office, we have lots of international students. So, my question is, as an advocate for immigration reform, so what specific advice you will have for non-U.S. Entrepreneurs, other than trying to marry a U.S. girl?
Well, this is a tough issue and something I spent a lot of time on the last few years. I actually thought we were close to getting something done, and then a few months ago things were halted. And hopefully after this midterm election in a couple weeks, we'll see a path to get it back on track. The way I look at it, I understand immigration is like a really complicated emotional issue, and there are all kinds of issues around border security and laws and so forth. But we are not going to remain the most innovative entrepreneurial nation if we don't win what is now a global battle for talent. And we will not win the global battle for talent unless we update our immigration system so we can remain a magnet for talent. We do a pretty good job, actually it's an excellent job at RPI and many other places, of getting people like you to come here. We do a terrible job of creating a pathway for them to stay here. And so it's really stupid because we're actually funding the education of people and then kicking them out, forcing them to basically create companies elsewhere that compete with companies here. And so we have to update those policies, and I think it has to be part of a broader solution. There's not the political will, at least right now, to just deal with it in a narrow way. It needs to be something more comprehensive, because there are other aspects of immigration that also are important to a lot of different groups. But at the end of the day, immigration is sort of this wonky term in Washington. It's about people. It's about talent. And everybody knows the university is only as good as the talent, the professors, the administrators. A company is only as good as its people. That's true for countries too. and how do we, kind of remain the magnet. Now, we do need to do a better job of educating our own kids and giving them the skills, but if we basically are just relying on that and forcing people, many of whom we've educated, to go elsewhere, we will wake up in the not too distant future and have lost our edge as the most innovative entrepreneurial nation. So it's a big issue and something that we need to figure out some path to get it done, hopefully in the coming months. In the meantime, I'd say, fight the best you can to stay here and figure out some way to obviously the different provisions that try to figure out some way to connect to. I hope you can stay here. We need people like you to stay here because the history of America is the history of immigration, and even the history of business is the history of immigration. 40% of Fortune 500 companies were started by at least one immigrant. A decade ago, 52% of Silicon Valley tech companies were started by at least one immigrant. It's now 42%. We've lost 10 points in 10 years. And it's going like this, and they're not like just going away. They're going to other companies in other countries that are going to be the next great, kind of competitive threat. And people if they want to come here and want to stay here and can build companies that create jobs and drive growth, we should encourage them and celebrate that, not make it difficult for them and kind of run them off.
Well, those of you who know me know I like to articulate in threes. So number one, I want to congratulate the Lally School on its extended 50th anniversary. Number two, I want to thank all of you for being such a great audience and for the wonderful, insightful questions. So give yourself a... And number three, I especially want to thank you, Steve, for being so generous with your time, and I've learned a lot myself this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.